This is Frankie Lynch, astrological consultant. FrankieLynch.com, at Frankie Astro on TikTok and Facebook, at Frankie Lynch 777 on Twitter and YouTube. Please, please, please smash that like and subscribe. Please, please, please. I need help with the algorithm because I'm just starting out. So anyway, I wanted to do a little video about houses in astrology because people get mad at me for bringing up the history of houses or the origin of houses or the source of their meanings. Yes. People get very annoyed when I say houses don't equal signs and signs don't equal houses. The meaning of the first house didn't come from Aries or Mars or whatever. It came from ancient sources, which we'll look at right now, because I have a fun little presentation that I'm going to give. I have to share my screen. And let's go. Okay. The origin of astrological houses. And we have all my little information down there in the bottom. So houses, there's going to be a couple questions we're going to touch upon. Number one, what are houses? Where do they come from? What's the source of their meanings? What are their meanings? And then look at a couple different house systems. The one that I prefer, whole sign, and quadrant houses, and the difference between them. So, house wars, right? The debate gets pretty heated, yeah? I've seen Chris Brennan even get into some heated debates. I've gotten into plenty myself. But honestly, it doesn't matter what house system you use. We live in an interdependent and relativistic universe. That will be the epitaph on my gravestone, if I have a gravestone. But everything just rests on that interdependent relativistic universe. So under those conditions, anything can mean anything. You can use anything for divination. You know, people use bones, people use tea leaves or whatever, and folk magic. Quite honestly, you could use your own vomit or feces if you were so inclined. And if you knew how to read them. I prefer astrology because we have, 6,000 years of history to go off of. But it's all about context, right? As long as you're reading within your context, do what works best for you. Knock yourself out. You do you. Stephen Hawking. Astrological houses are portals through which the gods touch our supple, quivering bodies. I know, I am the laws of physics. He didn't really say that, but it's funny, So, in a way, there's something in that, right? The zodiac itself is transcendent, right? It's in the heavens, whereas the houses relate to our daily lives, right? They're areas of our life in which things happen. Yeah. So the zodiac touches us through the houses. What are they? Like I just said, they represent the areas of life in which things take place. Yeah. So they're where the zodiac, the heavenly zodiac, touches earthly experience, as we just said. I've heard it said, I think Robert Hand is the one who advanced this idea, right? And it makes perfect sense because all things are interdependent and hence analogical. We have that fun law in occultism or esotericism called the law of correspondence. All it means is using something you already know to understand something you don't know. Yeah. It creates a bridge in consciousness. The thing about the houses is they can relate to the modern conception of psychology, of astrology, right? Which is very psychological. And therefore you can see the houses and really the whole chart as a psychological map, right? Displaying the facets of you, right? Which are unfolding and the subjective equipment you have at your disposal. Or they can relate to completely external and mundane, normal things, right? The fourth house can be your dad, or it can be the deepest part of yourself. The fifth house can be your kids, or it can be your creative self, you know? There are all different ways of looking at it. The chart, and another way, right, in the ancient conception, is really can be a very material map of your literal life, right? So there's different ways of looking at it. The other thing the houses did is divide the sky. They are 12 divisions of the sky. And therein lies the analogy between the zodiac and the houses. Here's a quick little timeline, right? I know this is so cute. So we actually have evidence that of proto-houses, right? We think that the Egyptian decans, right? We think that they were a prototype of what became astrological houses. There were 36 Egyptian decans, right? And they divided up the sky like our houses do today. They actually, as it says here, they first appear on coffin lids around 2100 BCE. Now, as we get to the 1st century BCE through the 2nd, this is the Hellenistic period, right? Really, it was the 4th century BCE once Alexander the Great, right, conquered that whole swath of land, you know, from the Mediterranean through Asia Minor, or parts of it, yeah? So we see evidence of whole sign here, 1st century BCE through the 2nd century CE, yeah? We see ancient charts, I believe from the 1st century, on papyri that use whole sign houses. Now we know that there were quadrant houses also at the time because various Valens described porphyry, which is a quadrant house system, and we'll talk about what those are and how they're derived a little bit later. The interesting thing about porphyry, right, that's it. We call it porphyry, but Porphyry of Tyre, who it's named for, lived about 100 years later than this description. But it's generally accepted to be the first quadrant house system, at least the first one we know of. And then another quadrant house system. In the 1160s, Regiomontanus is invented by Ibn Ezra. Well, this is the story, and you can find this information on astro.com. Although some of this I also got from Chris Brennan. Regiomontanus, right? But it's named later for Regiomontanus in the 1450s, the philosopher. In the 1650s, we know that the Italian monk Placidus de Titus develops the Placidus house system. There's a couple competing stories about this. The first that I'm aware of was that the theory that Placidus de Titus was misreading or misunderstanding Ptolemy's description of equal houses. We know that equal houses actually go back to the same time whole sign houses were as well. Okay. So we think that it may have been a misreading of Ptolemy's description. However, there are sources, and I found this on astro.com, that say it was invented much earlier. So anyway, then there's a big gap, yeah? Bit by bit, medieval astrology gives way sort of to the modern conception. Once we get to the 1700s, you know, there's the scientific revolution and we have the Enlightenment. And bit by bit, there's sort of a rejection of things that aren't regarded as scientific, you know. We know that a bunch of the philosoph types were still into astrology, you know. However, it's not till the late 18th century, right, that Alan Leo sort of writes the first books on modern astrology, yeah. He's a theosophist, right? Then later, Dane Rudyard, also a theosophist. Yeah, we could talk about theosophy in another video. In fact, I think I do. Go check it out. Dane Rudyard, who is an unparalleled genius, right? A musical genius especially. He writes the book Astrology of Personality. And it first describes houses in psychological terms. And this is the birth of psychological astrology, right? In the 1930s, psychoanalysis, really sort of in-depth psychology, take off. It's when Pluto is discovered, yeah? Anyway, in the 1950s, Friedrich Zanzinger and Heinz Schwartz would invent the Koch house system, which was named for Walter Koch, of course, but these two gentlemen invented it. So you could see this theme of other people naming other house systems after other people. Anyway, then in the 1970s, we get this 12-letter alphabet thing, which I sort of started off this presentation with, where signs equal houses, right? It equates the meanings, yeah, of the houses with the meanings of the signs. And again, he's influenced by Rudyard. So where do houses come from? Motion, right? There's two types of motion in astrology that we are concerned with, primarily. There's primary motion. What's primary motion? It's the first thing people witness, right? It's what the ancients saw right in front of them. It's the rising and setting of objects over the course of a day, yeah? This is created by the Earth spinning on its axis, yeah? This movement is clockwise. This is very important. It is clockwise, whereas secondary motion is the movement of objects through the zodiac in the counterclockwise motion. And of course, this visible anomaly is created by the Earth and the other planets orbiting the sun. So as we said earlier, houses divide the sky. You can see a fun little illustration here, right? So as I've often said, it's not the constellations that define the zodiac. The signs don't get their meanings from the constellations necessarily. The primary sources of the meanings of the signs comes from A, the planets that rule them, and B, their place in the solar cycle, right? Their place in the cycle of a solar year in the Northern Hemisphere. Yeah. That doesn't mean that we have to flip the zodiac for the Southern Hemisphere, right? Astrology is geocentric, not hemisphere-centric. The zodiac applies to the Earth, yeah, not just a hemisphere. Unfortunately, we derive our meanings mostly from the situation in the Northern Hemisphere, right? So Aries, right, rises in the east, yeah? There's a connection here between the cardinal signs, the cardinal points, and the cardinal directions, yeah? Even though signs don't equal houses, but we fixed Aries in tropical astrology at the vernal equinox for very important reasons. So you can see the symbolism is all about the alternation between light and dark over the course of a solar year, yeah? The cycle of equinoxes and solstices, yeah? Whereas the houses are sort of a replication of that in miniature, instead of over the course of a year, over the course of a day. Right? The sun rises in the east where things first become visible. It reaches a zenith, right? At the meridian, the highest point in the sky, where things are most visible and most prominent. Then they set in the west, opposite the place they rose. And they descend to their deepest, darkest point where they're least visible. Right? I mean, this whole sign, the dark side of the earth, you're not going to see, right? The midnight spot where things are least visible and most hidden. So, well, there are three types of houses, right? We just talked a little bit about the proto-significations of the angular houses, yes? So angular houses, 1st, 10th, 7th, 4th, yeah? So as we were saying, things first rose in the east. That's where the sun first became visible, right? It's where all objects first become visible. Your rising sign is the sign of the zodiac, or the degree of that sign, that was coming up over the eastern horizon as you were born, as you took your first breath, right? So where objects first became visible in the east, that became you. That's your birth, right? So the first house came to symbolize, right, you and body and mind and spirit, all of you. And then objects rose to their highest point, right? The sun reaches its high point at high noon, right? The glory and the beauty of the day, the middle of the day. In fact, your midheaven, it means your medium coeli, which means in Latin, the middle of the sky. Yeah, I think it's Latin. And then we get down to the setting place, right? Where objects set in the west. And this is called, well, it's called the setting place, right? But it's the house opposite the first, right? So this is you. Opposite you became others, right? Marriages, partnerships, your other half, so to speak. And then we reach the deepest, darkest place where you couldn't see anything. That became the fourth house, right? This became your origins, because it's from this place that objects travel where we don't see them, origins, yeah, to then become visible. So it also came to represent the father, right? Why is that? Because in ancient Mesopotamia, where astrology comes from, it was the father that legitimated the birth, right? By placing you on his lap. That's what made you a legitimate birth, and that's what showed that was the source of your seed, you know? So anyway, you could see there the first significations, or the budding significations, of the angular houses, right? Angular houses are the most powerful, right? So we could almost say the first house was the most powerful, and the 10th house was next, because that's the most visible. Then the 7th, and then the 4th. Now there are 3 types of houses, right? Excuse me, there's angular, which we just said. There's succedent, which are increasing in power. And then there are cadent, which are declining in power. So this is interesting because one might look at this and say, oh my gosh, we're saying succedent is rising up towards an angle, right? But why is it going 11 to 10? Shouldn't it be going 10 to 11? Remember, primary motion, it moves clockwise. So the houses move clockwise according to the rising and culminating of objects. Yeah. So keep that in mind. For example, a succedent house, the 11th house, it's rising up towards the 10th. The 10th is where things are most visible, right? It's the culmination. It's the honor. It's the recognition. It's success. So then the 11th house, rising up towards it, the hope of success, the hope of honor and recognition. Yeah. It's the idealism. It's hopes and wishes. Yeah. We'll talk about other sources for the house meanings in just a second, but you can see some of that. So the succedent houses are increasing in power towards an angular house, and then cadent is declining in power from that angle and falling away. So this is where a lot of the house meanings come from, and we'll unpack some of that in just a moment. But you can see then that hemispheres add another dimension to this, particularly this division between the South and North Hemisphere. So the North Hemisphere was all the things that were invisible when you were born, below the horizon. Whereas the South was everything above the horizon, which was visible when you were born. So everything in the north, or the northern houses, came to symbolize things of the flesh and the body, and you personally, yeah, or people around you personally in your little sphere, right? Whereas the things up above the horizon came to represent the mind, the body, the mind and the spirit, not the body. And, other people not necessarily in your home and all this sort of stuff. So going back to these, for example, you can see a succeedent house rising up the 11th towards the angle in the 10th, and also being in the southern hemisphere, having to do with the mind, right? You can see the idealism. You can see pleasure of the mind, which is what the 11th house was often called, the pleasures of the mind, where Jupiter finds his joy. We can see, we see philosophy and other things in the 9th house, but the idealism and for example, political ideals we'll often see in the 11th house, rising towards a manifestation of whatever that ideal is. Yeah. Or, for example, in the declining house here, right? We know it's of the mind and the spirit, 9th house. We also know it's declining from the angle, right? Where you get honor and recognition. And then the declining energy here is the contemplation and the reflection, right? Which have a lot to do with religion, spirituality, right? Higher education, things like that, which is also of the mind. Yeah. You could look at the 1st house, the angle here, right? And then we have a subterranean house, right? These are subterranean, below the earth. The succeedent house here is the 2nd, rising up towards the 1st. What do you need when you're born? You need material resources to support the life, right? You need food, stuff, shelter, the resources of the 2nd house. Rising towards the 1st to give rise to you, and then declining away is the 12th house, which had to do with self-undoing, right? Therefore, it's declining, yeah. We see things like, mental illness, and it was called the house of bad spirit, right? Which is why it became associated with the bad things of the mind, right? The opposite house, the 6th, was called the house of bad fortune or bad health, right? Bad body. So bad material fortune, right? And then bad spirit or mental fortune, perhaps, or spiritual fortune. You could think about in that way. Now, there's another dimension to house meanings too. We don't have to touch on all the houses here. The other source of house meanings are whether or not they're configured or not to the 1st house by a traditional aspect, right? So that means a sextile, a square, a trine, or the opposition, yeah? It's funny because the ancients didn't really consider the conjunction to be an aspect because they weren't looking at each other. And the word aspect comes from espicere, from Latin, which means to look at or to behold, right? So the idea was making an aspect was planets casting gazes at each other or looking at each other. Harsh aspects were angry gazes, whereas these harmonious aspects were, nicer gazes. So you see here, the 1st house makes a sextile to the 11th and the 3rd, a square to the angles, right? The 4th and the 10th, a trine to the 9th and the 5th, and finally an opposition to the 7th. So you see the houses that were configured to the 1st were considered good for the most part, right? Because they were seen, yeah? So even though the 9th house is what's called cadent or declining, it was still a beneficent or good house because it was configured to the 1st by a trine. Therefore it became the house of God, right? So you see this house, right, sort of, declining from man, yeah. So you could think about it as the other realm, where this is totally visible. This is becoming more and less visible, if you will. So now the houses that aren't configured to the first are the 12th, 8th, 6th, and 2nd, right? Now, these were said to be in an aversion or not seen. And houses that were not seen by the first house were considered bad houses, or less good, if you will. I know in modern astrology, they hate the words malefic and benefic, but I always say, nothing's necessarily good or bad in an interdependent and relativistic universe. But how do you feel when you get slapped in the face? I mean, I like that sort of thing sometimes, but that's a whole nother thing. So anyway, the second house, though, we don't think of that as a bad house, do we? Well, it's succeedent and it's rising up towards the first, right? And it has to do with our possessions. It's subterranean, yes. So we get some of these house meanings then. Number one, from the positions in the sky over the course of a day, what's called diurnal rotation or primary motion, and then leading, right, to these three types of houses. Another dimension from which we derive the meaning, yeah? Time of day, type of house. And the hemisphere. Is it more body-oriented or more spirit and mind-oriented? And then is the house configured to the first house by an aspect, right? A traditional aspect. I don't usually play with the minor aspects anymore because we get plenty of information from these. But anyone can do whatever. So whole sign houses. This is the house system that I primarily use, right? As I say here in the presentation, is generally accepted as the oldest and most widely used house system in the ancient world, right? Like I said, we have evidence of ancient Egyptian, well, not ancient, first century BCE to CE, more or less. Evidence of charts on papyri that use whole sign houses. They were the most convenient because you didn't necessarily need to know the degree of the rising or the midheaven, which we'll talk about that in just a second. The thing about whole sign houses, right? You could think of it as the signs are the houses, right? I know that I said signs don't equal houses, and they don't in terms of meaning. However, in the ancient world, the signs were the houses. You basically started the east, which is the first house, with the sign of rising, right? So if you think about it like that, each of the zodiacal signs are moving through each of these sky positions or parts of the sky over the course of the day. If you animate or animate a chart to go forward in time, it'll look like the houses are moving. The way I think of it, though, is it's really the signs that are moving, right? I mean, it's the earth that's moving, of course, but it's the signs that are moving relative to these positions of the sky. I mean, really, it's the positions of the sky that are moving. But if we think about it like that, then we get a lot better of an idea. You see, the chart is like a map of the horizon when you were born, right? It's a map of the sky when you were born, right? As beheld from the earth, yeah? So, right here, this chart is Sagittarius rising. I know I said Leo here, because it's the United States here, the Sibley chart, which, we just say, July 4th, 17th, for the signing of the declaration. How unprofessional yawning in this. So Sagittarius was coming up over the horizon when the United States was born. Therefore, Sagittarius became the first house. And then all the other signs in sequence, right? Now, to me, it's the first and the most elegant house system. right? It's widely accepted to be such, and at least the most widely used in the ancient world. Simplicity to me is elegance. And I get so much more information without the nonsense of houses swallowing signs or signs swallowing houses. It's called intercepted houses or intercepted signs. I always tell people the only interceptions I tolerate are basketball and soccer, the two sports I play. So anyway, to me, I get a lot more information out of this. Robert Hand even says that whole sign houses just work better. I used Placidus and equal houses for 15 years before I really started to dig into whole sign. It was resistant at first, but once I really got into it, I left all the other house systems behind. I can read whatever, but whole sign gives me the best information. Now, quadrant houses. This is like Placidus, like Porphyry, the other ones we talked about. So they divide the chart into quadrants. In order to have these calculated, you need to have the ascendant degree and the midheaven degree, because that's where they start the first and 10th house, right? So therefore, the first, the ascendant descendant axis starts the first and the 7th house respectively. And then the midheaven and the IC, which stands for Imam Coeli, which means bottom of the sky, the lowest point. This became the 10th and 4th house axis. And then the other houses were divided up in the quadrants, according to different rules. Placidus, I believe, did it in 2-hour increments. And that's how they would decide the house cusps. So you see, this would have been harder to calculate in the ancient world. I mean, because you would have needed the ascendant degree and the midheaven degree. But we do see reference, right, in ancient astrology to Porphyry, right, to quadrant houses. Excuse me, but they had more specialized purposes. For example, Porphyry was used more in finding the master of the nativity, which was one ancient technique, and the length of life technique. But we also see, Vedius Valens and other ancient astrologers who cite these quadrant houses use mostly whole sign. So you can use whatever you want, but I prefer it. So anyway, the 12-letter alphabet, we touched on it for a second. It's the idea that houses got their meanings from the signs. Modern astrologers didn't understand where houses come from. There was a big gap in astrological understanding that happened between, the medieval Renaissance period and the modern era. Yeah, it really wasn't until the 1980s that we started to incorporate ancient astrology more and more into the mainstream. There were translations of ancient texts that were discovered, ancient Greek texts, etc., Egyptian texts. So, for example, the idea is that, Aries equal Mars equals the first house. And so I see all this nonsense online about natural rulers and Venus always rules the 7th house. And I'm like, Venus only rules the 7th house if you're Aries rising or if you're Scorpio rising, right? So, and if you've been paying attention this whole time, you could see very clearly that the house meanings don't come from the signs. There might be some overlap, right? For example, Sagittarius, becomes known for being philosophical and things like that. It's ruled by Jupiter, which is the planet of philosophy. And then the 9th house gets known for philosophy, but it's not because of Jupiter or because of Sagittarius. It's because we're declining away from the zenith of life, right? From when we're most potent and visible. And then we get into that later stage where we start reflecting and contemplating the meaning of it all, right? So again, you see some overlap, but We know from that little timeline thing that this whole 12-letter alphabet thing started in the 1960s and 70s with the rise of modern astrology, right? Dane Rudyard, Alan Leo were the most widely read in the 1960s. So basically, modern astrology was erected upon their understanding. And their understanding was primarily erected upon theosophy, which was itself a late 19th century movement, spiritual movement led by Madame Blavatsky, which sought to bridge, the spiritual traditions of the East and West, or what have you. So anyway, you can see they were influenced by that quite a bit. And theosophy is sort of like the philosophical basis for modern astrology. Whereas itself, if you get into theosophy, and I was sort of raised a little bit in it, you see the undercurrent, right? Ancient philosophies like Hermeticism, Platonism, Vedic philosophy, right? She even incorporates some Tibetan Buddhism, yeah? And a lot of this stuff was the philosophical basis for ancient astrology, ancient Egyptian philosophy, Babylonian philosophy, etc. So you see this unbroken lineage in a way, stretching from antiquity to the modern era. The other funny thing that happened in the 1960s and 70s is that publishing companies, as soon as astrology books started getting more popular, publishing companies found that they could save money by printing half the pages if signs were the same as houses. So for example, Liz Green, who I love, one of my favorite books is her Saturn book, yeah? When you read it, it'll say, Saturn and Aries are the first house. And I'm like, oh, please, no. Yeah. Saturn and Sag or the ninth house, totally different things, So anyway, just beware of that. I know I did the whole signs equal houses things for, years until I discovered this. Again, it was a hard pill to swallow, but once I figured it out, my astrology readings got a lot better. So now, which system is more accurate? Of course, I say none, right? Nothing's more accurate. It depends on the context in which you're using it. It also depends very, very heavily on the reader. Yeah. Astrology is not a science. We can get significations and interpretations by understanding the sources, though. You see? A lot of people who write astrology books with those cookie-cutter interpretations, they're able to derive those and original ones because they understand where they came from, right? So if you understand that Aries, right, is a fire sign, yeah? And that it's ruled by Mars, yeah? And that it comes, right, as the light just begins to wax in the cycle of a solar year, then you can derive some very potent meanings for Aries. And it's a cardinal sign, yeah? So anyway, in this situation, everything depends on everything else for its existence, right? As I say here, you could read your own vomit if you were so inclined, as I said earlier. I prefer whole sign houses because it's so simple. And to me, simplicity is beauty. And our granddaddy, right, of the modern application of ancient astrology even said, whole sign houses just work better. So I'll leave you with that. Once again, this is Frankie Lynch. Please like and subscribe. Smash that like that smash. Please, please, please. FrankieLynch.com. I love you.